Hey everyone, welcome into another edition of No Holds Barred here at the Toronto Sun. Rob Wong, joined alongside by longtime WCW executive. He is a WWE Hall of Famer. He is the current Chief Media Officer for Real American Freestyle. And of course, he has his podcast, 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. We welcome back Eric Bischoff. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing great, man. It's good to be with you guys again.
Yeah, great to chat with you as always. Before we get into the pro wrestling stuff, got to talk to you about Real American Freestyle, a big card coming up in about 11 days or so. A couple of guys that obviously got their starts when it comes to freestyle wrestling, but have gone on to become big MMA stars. Michael Chandler and Chad Mendez, a huge fight we've got going on here at RAF. How did that all come about, and how excited are you for that matchup specifically, but just for the whole card?
Well, the whole card is going to be exciting. The Chad Bronstein, my partner, and Izzy Martinez, my other partner, they're the ones that are really spending the time putting these matches together. Izzy, of course, comes from the world of freestyle wrestling, as does Chad. But Izzy's, active. He's coaching MMA fighters who are training in wrestling and things like that. So the relationship we have with the athletes, both on the freestyle side and the MMA side, is pretty extensive. And what's really interesting is so many of your elite MMA fighters, UFC, for example, come from a freestyle wrestling background. It's freestyle wrestling is such an important component of the MMA game. And the MMA fans, UFC fans, are starting to recognize that now. They're a much smarter fan. They're a more intelligent fan. They know more about the sport today, obviously, than they did even 10 years ago, because the sport has advanced so much, and UFC has done such a great job infotaining their audience and just making them appreciate what goes into the sport. Well, the good news for Real American Freestyle is that a lot of these UFC fighters, people that compete generally in MMA, they have the ability within their contracts to also compete with us. So it's a great way for Bo Nickel, for example, who just fought in UFC, got a nice round kick, head kick there for a win. Bo may only fight twice a year in the UFC, but it allows him to compete, keep his ground game sharp, improve his ground game in between fights. So I think the consensus amongst a lot of MMA fighters, at least right now, is that Real American Freestyle is a great way to up your MMA game and keep your level sharp between fights.
It really is remarkable, just to see the evolution of how things have gone in MMA. I'm old enough to remember the first time I watched the UFC was back in those, Ken Shamrock days, of course, in the mid '90s when it all got started. But you see,
Tank
even
Abbott,
just
remember
this
Tank Abbott?
Tank Abbott, right? Yeah, I mean, guys like that, and even just this recent card that you mentioned with Bo Nickel, and we saw what he's been able to do in the evolution of his individual game, but the main event with Islam Makhachev, and his Dagestani wrestling is clearly on a different level than other people, but it's pretty clear that you can't compete in MMA at the highest level anymore without having some sort of a grappling or a wrestling background. You're just at a disadvantage if you don't have that aspect to your game.
Well, that's why it's so, I mean, that's why we're so excited about Real American Freestyle because we're not really competing with the UFC, obviously, right?
Yeah.
We're not even in the same conversation, but yet we're kind of adjacent sports so that fans of MMA in general or UFC in particular can check out what we're doing over here and see some of their favorite fighters, see their ground game up close because it's a little different than what they would see in a UFC ring or an MMA ring. So it's a great time to be in the Real American Freestyle business.
Absolutely. So moving into the pro wrestling side of things, last time we had you on, you of course gave your thoughts on John Cena's retirement tour and how you thought it, was really turning out to be terrific. And here we are, hard to believe it, less than a month left to go here for John Cena with his final match coming in early December. What do you make of this tournament that they're sort of putting together to try to come up with his opponent? Do you feel as though maybe that was the best way to go about it, as opposed to just naming someone or trying to craft a storyline specifically for that, or do you feel this sort of tournament and aspect of putting a bunch of different challengers together makes it more intriguing to you?
I think it's way more intriguing. I love the tournament format going into this. I'm actually surprised to hear myself say that because tournament formats typically in professional wrestling generally don't work that well. Um, they should because it provides great structure and stakes, and there's kind of built-in story if you allow it to be. But generally, in professional wrestling, tournaments are used as just a hot shot type of an angle to get you through a creative dry spell, and you need to shuffle the deck, so to speak. But this is, I think, a very well thought out plan. I think it showcases my impression, at least, of John Cena's desire to go out and do the right thing, to showcase a bunch of other young emerging talent, as opposed to reaching into your back pocket and pulling out a legacy challenger. Just say, for example, Randy Orton or somebody that had a reason, creatively speaking, a history, backstory. You could pull out one of those legends from John's era and do that, or you can let John shine while he's sharing the limelight with a bunch of younger, newer, fresher faces that will be the next generation of John Cena somewhere down the road. So to me, that it's consistent with who John is and the way John, I think, looks at the business. And I'm for it, man. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how it shakes out in the end as well. And, nostalgia is always a part of professional wrestling. There's a reason that people, want to see guys from the past come back, or, you're trying to fantasy book, oh, if we ever get to see this guy take on this guy or this woman face off against this woman, that's a big part of the business. And right now it seems like WWE, at least in recent weeks here, has been leaning on that. And I think it's great. I mean, seeing AJ Lee back and seeing Nikki Bella, Brock Lesnar coming back. And we saw just recently here Monday Night Raw with Dolph Ziggler making his return as well. I'm a big fan of that because, like I said, growing up watching a lot of these wrestlers, it's nice to see them take on some of the current wrestlers in the current era. But there is a section of the fan base, and I don't know how big that fan base is, Eric, that don't love the leaning on past stars, and they want to see more of the current younger stars get an opportunity. Where do you land on that as far as trying to lean on the old herd, if you will, and also giving the same opportunities to some of the younger current wrestlers?
I mean, it's balance. It's more of an art than it is a science, meaning it depends on who the legendary, wrestler is that you're bringing back for the nostalgia pop, right? How that individual wrestler is being used. Is it too much? Is it not quite enough? Is it just perfect? And I think those are the variables that kind of define whether something is a success or not. I think it's always a great idea to use. I mean, every sport does it. Every sport, whether it's the NFL or Major League Baseball or the NHL, it's always constantly paying homage to the names that came before, whether it's the name of a trophy or whatever. But we're always, tipping the hat, so to speak, to the legends, and I think that works really well in wrestling. It keeps you connected with the sport, or with in this case the entertainment. Um, but like anything else, you can overdo it and you can rely too heavily on it, or you may misjudge somebody who you're bringing in that role, and it doesn't really quite connect with the audience the way you thought it would. There's always variables, but I think in general it's a good idea. I think it keeps people generationally connected to the sport. Or you wouldn't believe how many times when I go to do conventions and autograph signings, you end up engaging people, right? They're not really coming for my autograph. They're really just coming to have a conversation and make eye contact and feel like they got to know you a little bit. The autograph is just the excuse for the most part. So when I sign autographs with people, I really make an attempt to make them feel comfortable and to engage with them and ask them questions, so that the experience is as good for them as it can be. But inevitably in the course of doing that, I'll hear these stories about, oh, I grew up watching wrestling with my dad, or I grew up with my granddad. In my case, I was introduced to professional wrestling in Detroit as a very young kid by my grandmother, right? And we all have that connective tissue to when we grew up watching it. And that gets passed down from father to son to son to son. And I think it's a great thing. So long-winded way, keep doing it, just don't do it too much.
Yeah, like I have a similar story as well. My grandfather is the one that got me into pro wrestling. He used to record old WWF on a VHS tape and handed it off to me, and that's how I became a wrestling fan. So, like you said, there's a lot of
And
similar
now here you
stories.
are.
And now
And
here
look
I
at
am
what's
talking to the one and only Eric Bischoff. And like how does that make you feel when you go to these conventions? And like you said, it's not people just wanting to get an autograph. Like they want to hear the behind the scenes stories or how things went about in WCW. You told these stories a million times, of course, but does it ever get old?
No, and what I found really is they're not coming to hear me tell stories. Now, if it's a Q and A session or, an evening with type of thing, that's a different thing. But when I'm just signing autographs and meeting people, they really just want to have a conversation like if it was you and them sitting at a bar having a beer. They want to get to know you. And when I hear those stories, some of them make me cry. I'll be honest with you. Some of them are very touching. And and even the ones that aren't necessarily emotionally, grabbing, so to speak, when people start sharing their most, when I say intimate, you know what I mean, personal stories about how they grew up and, what wrestling meant to them. And sometimes they'll take you through emotional periods of their lives where they kind of leaned on professional wrestling as an escape, whether it's kids in school being mean or more serious issues with loved ones and illnesses and tragedies. People look for escapes. And when I hear those stories of how sometimes people found that escape in WCW programming, it makes me more grateful for what I was able to do. Because when I was in the business, it was my job. It was a fun job. Don't get me wrong. I'm not making it sound like, I went to a factory and punched widgets all day. It was an exciting, dynamic, fun job, but I didn't appreciate it the way I could have and should have, like, because I never looked at it as something that could actually be helping someone. I just looked at what we did as fun entertainment, not thinking about that, husband who's sitting at home because his wife's in the hospital with a terminal situation and he's got two young kids and he doesn't know what he's going to do and he thinks about it 22 hours a day, but for this 1 hour he's going to watch Nitro and not think about it. When you hear that, you appreciate your opportunities. I do, from a different perspective. That's the best way to say it.
Yeah, it really is remarkable the impact that pro wrestling has on a lot of people's lives. Just to take it back a little bit further for myself, I can still remember the first time I saw War Games. I bought a VHS, or my mom bought me a VHS at a discount store, and back then I was a WWF fan, and this was during the Hulk Hogan era. So that was a certain style of wrestling. I did not know a different style of wrestling could have existed, as we saw in the NWA there and early WCW with War Games. And I bring that up because we've got War Games coming up here now with the WWE. And I know you've talked about it before, how your relationship with War Games, you thought maybe it didn't have enough of a persona. It wasn't a tentpole event, and WCW sort of went away from it there. But what were the challenges of putting on an event like that? And how did you view it at the time? Because, now we talk about nostalgia. I think that's a big reason why it probably has returned in a lot of different ways with NXT and WWE. But where were you at with it in the mid 90s? Because there were some great War Games matches. I can think of 1996, of course, with Sting and the NWO, 97, probably my favorite with the Kurt Hennig heel turn on the Four Horsemen. That one really stands out to me. But what were your thoughts about that event when you guys were running it in WCW in the mid 90s?
I generally just have never, ever, ever enjoyed, as a fan or as a producer, I have never enjoyed any kind of battle royale concept. Multiple people in the ring just pisses me off. Like I start out aggravated as hell because I'm looking at a ring full of guys and they're walking around in circles and they're throwing weird looking punches and they're not paying attention to the person behind them that's about ready to hit him in the head with something. It's like the lack of logic that goes into any kind of a multi-person match. I have a hard time getting over that hump. It's like when you go to a movie, you're all excited to see this new movie that's coming out. Famous director, famous cast, everyone's excited. And you sit down in that movie, and the first thing that happens is you see a microphone come down in the boom shot. You see a boom mic come down in the camera. And they just left it in there because fuck, nobody saw it. It takes you out of the moment. You're sitting there going, you just paid $20 for a ticket to this movie, and somebody left a microphone dangling in the frame of a shot, and the editor just left it in there. It takes you out of the moment. And the same thing happens to me when I see more than two people in a ring. So it just seems so awkward that it takes me out of the moment. Now, that being said, Royal Rumble, that's a format I can get with because you're cycling people through there. There's anticipation, right? There's the surprise. You never know. There's the story so Royal Rumble is an exception, but it's because of the unique format that it's an exception. War games in and of itself, yes, there's some structure to it. I get all that, but it's just never been I just don't like those kinds of matches. Never have, even as a fan.
Yeah, look, that's an interesting perspective when you put it that way. I mean, I do feel that way, interestingly enough, for the Royal Rumble, where there's, a mass amount of humans in there, and the camera's trying to focus on different things, and you're trying to pay attention to who's in the ring at that point still and who's getting eliminated. So there is a lot happening, but it also doesn't help that.
There's no logic. Like if you're a fan and you're watching it, you can't put yourself in anybody's shoes and go, well, that makes sense. Like none of it makes any sense. It starts out not making any sense and only gets worse from there. You feel me?
I understand where you're coming from. Maybe it's just the nostalgia in me. I'm a big fan of war games. Always have been. It's just
And a lot of
it made
people
an
are.
impression on me as a kid. Yeah.
A lot
So
of people are.
we'll see what happens this time around. I mean, it's going to be a star-studded war games, that's for sure. Coming up at Survivor Series with some of the big names that WWE has set for this one. But Eric, as always, man, appreciate the time. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure. Anytime. You know where to find me.